Quand un ou une journaliste française pose une question, ça n'est pas le gouvernement de la France. Et c'est bien comme ça. Mais il ne faut pas tout confondre.
Non,
parce que mais c'est pas une position de la France.
Je faisais allusion.
Parce qu'il n'y a pas, il y en a eu.
Je faisais allusion au propos de Le Drian. Lui, il est officiel français.
Oui, mais
le compromis à l'africaine, c'est Le Drian, c'est pas la journaliste.
C'est exact, mais ce compromis. Mais cette formule, Président.
President Felix said, "Not on my watch. You are not gonna lie on us when I am standing here and breathing." He stopped him when he tried to insinuate if reporters are asking you the questions, it has nothing to do with the French government. Really? No. That's a blatant lie because your own ministers say those things. Your own ministers degrade African countries. Your own ministers make statements. So no, your ministers represent the French government. Hence, French government is accountable for the things that are being said. So he was rightfully called out. And if you have noticed, President Macron has really changed his tone, and now he's all about partnership with African countries, no longer a dictatorship. We all know that's BS, and I am happy to see African countries, African leaders calling him out. As you saw, the Democratic Republic of Congo leader stopped him when he tried to deny. The Central African Republic leader also called out the Western governments just recently. So it's really wonderful to see our leaders finally standing up and speaking up, because that is the right thing to do. We're all sovereign countries and no one should dictate any African country in the 21st century.
China ends up being the leader of the socialist and progressive world. It's willy-nilly. Whether you want the role or not, it is thrust upon you. You're the focus of the imperialist onslaught. You're the main target for the US's attempt to re-establish its hegemony over the world. China is reaching out in solidarity, in friendship, in trade. It is developing infrastructure. It is financing projects. It is engaged in collaboration. It is engaged in cultural exchanges, education, etc. with Africa. Across the length and breadth of the continent, China is establishing mutually beneficial and science-based relations with Africans. And that is good. I'm not saying that China doesn't seek to get the best deal it can on specific transactions and so on. Trade is trade. We're all horse thieves when it comes down to it. But trade is very different from colonial acquisitions and domination. Now, on the other hand, imperialism's, and particularly the US and Europe's response to the fact of Africa's potential wealth is very different. That seeks to dominate and to control Africa's future. And this is partly an objective in itself, to access these resources for the benefit of American capital, American transnational corporations, and so on. So this is the context in which African geopolitics is changing.
But in the Berlin Conference, 1884 to 1885, also known as the Congo Conference or West Africa Conference, met on 15th of November 1884, and after an adjournment concluded on the 26th of February 1885 with the signature of a general act regulating the European colonization and trade in Africa during the new imperialism period. The conference was organized by Otto von Bismarck, the first Chancellor of Germany, at the request of King Leopold II.
There you go. And you go back and find out what Leopold did. 25 million people killed in Congo, hands chopped off, and chocolate bars made in the form of hands. And the Belgians will be eating chocolates to celebrate the death of the Africans.
Thank you to Dr. Lwazi Lushaba. He touches on that on his interview on SAFM. Guys, Google it, Dr. Lwazi Lushaba on SAFM. When I think he was trending at the time a few years ago, just before the COVID-19 lockdowns, and he was asked about some of the statements that he had made about Hitler. And then he went on to dig in deeper into the conversation. He broadened it. And then he started speaking about the atrocities that happened there and how many people's hands were chopped.
When I get into the atrocities of the European and colonial system, particularly the slave trade and the Congo genocide, I actually get upset. I might end up saying things here that will get your podcast actually sanctioned on the international market. Ask me why.
Why?
Because you cannot have 2 million Jews who die in Germany and you coin up words, anti-Semitism, anti-what, to protect the Jews. And you look over your shoulder, you have more than 100 million blacks who have died and have been killed. And there's no one who has come up with the concept of anti-black. And Jews are allowed to celebrate. And if you say anything against the Jews, then you are labeled as anti-Semitic.
But can't black people do the same thing?
We don't have control over the system that narrates this story so that we can actually begin to say, you cannot say to me 2 million Jews, whether it is true or it is exaggerated. That's a conversation for another day. But 2 million Jews die. Hitler is the most horrible man. Leopold kills 20 million Africans. And he's still not the most West man that ever lived. Can you process that? Hitler kills 2 million white people. He's the most evil man that ever lived. Leopold kills 20 million Africans. He still does not appear on the list of the most wicked people that ever lived on the earth. There must be something wrong with this narrative. Totally something wrong with that narrative. It can be right by day, by night, by numbers, by mathematics, by ethnography. It cannot be right. That the whole world watches the massacre of black people and says nothing. And we want to call up holidays over the death of 2 million Jews as if it is the worst disaster that ever happened on the face of the earth was the death of 2 million white people. There must be something wrong with our language, unless maybe I'm crazy. But from mathematics, I think there's disparity right there. That someone is not being honest about the authenticity of history and the dignity of human life. And if this is true, that 2 million Jews are much more important than 20 million Africans, then maybe we're on the wrong continent, where value of human life must be equal.
A lot of people are saying...
I'm sorry for being emotional.
A lot of people are saying the fall of the American dollar is here. Your opinions on BRICS? Saudi Arabia just announced, Saudi Arabia, I'd say maybe it's on the fence for lack of a better word. We've just heard Mexico has just announced to be joining BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa and China. We've seen a lot of images lately of Xi Jinping with Mr. Putin. And there was just a conference here in South Africa, I think it was about a week ago. And I had some interesting statements from Mr. Julius Malema as well, saying there will not be any Putin that will be arrested here. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, are hypocrites. What are your opinions?
Here is the American dollar. Here is a buyer. Here is a seller. The American dollar becomes the middleman between the transactions. And they've enjoyed this in terms of trade. They've enjoyed this in terms of oil, that all international products were earmarked and benchmarked in the American dollar. So Americans did not even need to become part of the deal. But because your transactions are based on their dollar, they were going to print their money to facilitate for the transaction. Without being there, the Reserve Bank of America would get a profit.
So that's what made the dollar powerful over the past decades.
Now the whole idea is happening that move this thing away. You want my gold, I want your silver. End of deal. Take what you want, I take what I want. And the American dollar is going aside. and the arrogance of the Americans, the bulliness of the Americans. Let me even throw it on the West side. America right now comes to Tanzania, comes to Ghana, comes to Zambia with 16 million. And guess what? 16 million only for Zambia. The 16 million, ask me, what is it for?
What is it for?
For human rights. Across the river, China and Russia coming to South Africa, ask me for what?
For what?
For a military training and skills sharing of security. So the Americans are more interested in a transgender, homosexual agenda around the world. They will invest their money and give you money to protect human rights. Russia and China are coming with weapons and militarization strategies so that we can protect ourselves. So I want to say this very loud and clear to the Americans. Continue on your transgender agenda. Stay there. Leave us to do politics on the other side. Because what we need right now is not a minority human rights activation. What we need is a societal transformation. And for you as Americans to think that we really envy that when you have an anti-lesbian, anti-gay, LGBT principle, then tourists would drop. Let me correct that once and for all, Sbu, and cut and clip this, and it must be loud and clear. Are you saying to me that all the tourists are gay? And when you hear that this is a non-gay zone, tourism will suffer? Question number one. Question number two, are you saying that we don't have a right to expressing ourselves as Africans? Question number three, if democracy means majority rules and majority votes against a principle, then why won't you allow that to become law? Are you saying the minority must manage the majority or the majority must manage the minority? Then if that whole ideology is wrong, then take democracy in a nice black dustbin bag and throw it outside. Because what you are telling us is by the people, for the people, with the people, and all those slogans you hear, what democracy represents. If we are 10 in the room and 9 people say no, and one person says yes, democracy says you go with the majority. So if we say we want to make Africa democratic, and the demographics of our democracy says no, then why do you philosophically want to manipulate the will of the majority to favor the will of the minority? Then this is where it really gets confusing to me. Because you're selling me one thing on one. I understand this democracy because it is based on the principle 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. When it comes to practice, no, you can't practice it like that. Then what do you want? Do you want democracy? You want anarchy? You want indigenous governance systems? You want meritocracy? Maybe let's find another way of governing ourselves. But the ideology of democracy being founded on majority rule does not count. Because the rule that runs the South African constitution right now is not majority count, but minority count.
Comradely, respected comrades and friends, in a truly fair, free and peaceful world, democracy takes many forms of expression, not only one. I believe democracy is a government in which all the people participate, in which the interests of the people reign supreme, in which their country's sovereignty, their country's honor is at the top. It seems that this month is a month of democracy discourse in the world. At the end of this month, there will be a conference in Lusaka, or a summit in Lusaka, Zambia, my country, led by the United States. They have come to Southern Africa to teach us democracy. a country that was opposed to our liberation, a country that supported colonial regimes, the apartheid regime in South Africa, the white racist minority regime in Zimbabwe, now Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, the Portuguese colonial governments in Mozambique, in Angola, in Guinea-Bissau, and Cape Verde, today is coming to Africa to teach us about democracy. A country that has toppled so many governments in Africa, that has led so many coups in Africa and other parts of the world, a country that has killed so many of our leaders in Africa and other parts of the world, the killers of Patrice Lumumba, those who toppled Kwame Nkrumah, those who killed Nasser, those who killed Muammar Gaddafi, today are coming to teach us about democracy. A country that has been built on brutal force, on enslavement of other human beings, on the humiliation of Africans, the exploitation of Africans, the plunder of Africa, today is coming to teach us about democracy. That's the arrogance, the imperialist arrogance, the racist arrogance that we are subjected to. We cannot have democracy where there is hegemony of the strongest, mightiest imperialist power. We cannot have democracy where a country's resources, a country's decisions are dictated to by another country. A country that is dominated by another country cannot be democratic. A country that lacks sovereignty cannot be democratic. A people that cannot decide for themselves cannot be democratic. A colony, a neo-colony cannot be democratic. That's why today, even at the United Nations, membership is on the basis of sovereignty. Only sovereign nations can be members of the United Nations, because only sovereign nations can decide for themselves. A colony cannot be a member of the United Nations. It's not by accident. It's not a mistake. If you have no respect for the dignity of others, if you have no respect for the sovereignty of other countries, you cannot claim to be a champion of democracy. They used to say, all roads lead to Rome. Today, we can confidently say, all roads to progress, all roads to what is better for humanity leads to Beijing. This is a country, this is a people that have developed themselves, that has developed itself without colonizing any country in the world, without plundering any country in the world, without subjugating any people in the world. This is a country that is developing with maximum respect for others, for their history, for their cultures, and recognizes the diversity that is there in civilization. We were only taught one form of civilization, one form of modernization. That was the Western way. Westernness was a measure of how civilized, how modern you are. We reject that. We reject it because it's not correct. We reject it because it's undemocratic. We reject it because it's uncivilized to think of the world and of other people in that way. Today, they cannot accept the fact that China has caught up with them. China is about to surpass them in many areas of human endeavor. The imperialist arrogance is inhibiting them from accepting that reality. The racist arrogance is inhibiting them from accepting that reality. But the world is changing. The changes we are witnessing today, as President Xi said in Moscow recently, or the other day, they have never been seen in 100 years.
My first question to you is, because we've seen this term called Sino-imperialism, right, by the Western media, because Chinese companies do have a lot of investments in multiple African countries. So I think over these years, I've seen so many reports by Western media describing China as the new imperialists in Africa. So do you see China as a new imperialist power in Africa?
What do they mean by imperialist power? China has never colonized an African country. There's no African country that has ever been a colony of China. And our dealings with China started long before the China they know today. We were dealing with China when China was a poor country, very poor. But China still more was willing to share whatever little it had, sometimes giving us more than they had, or they could give their own people. For instance, in Southern Africa, in Zambia, China participated in our liberation struggle. The Chinese people, the Communist Party of China, helped us liberate ourselves from those who are trying to call them imperialists today, who dominated us, who colonized us, humiliated us for centuries. China helped us to liberate ourselves. China helped us to defend our independence and develop economically. Zambia was a blockaded country. All the neighbors were still either under colonial domination by the Portuguese or under the domination of apartheid and white racist regimes in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. We had no access to the ports. Our only access was to Dar es Salaam, which had no good road, no rail. The Chinese Communist Party, the people of China, managed to help to build us a rail, which was a very, very difficult project at that time because China did not have the resources, both financial, technical, and human capital. They didn't have it. But they undertook such a big project in which 70 Chinese lives were lost. China did not have corporations mining minerals in Africa, trading in Africa, doing all sorts of business in Africa when China was helping us. It's only now that China is participating in a lot of economic activities in Africa, but not on terms that are different from others. Sometimes even on more favorable terms to Africa than the Western companies. So where is the imperial domination of China? Where is China's imperial interest in Africa, in Zambia, in the third world? It's them who dominated us for centuries, who colonized us, enslaved us, exploited us. Yes, we have minerals, strategic minerals. Minerals needed for the 21st century technologies. For instance, Congo DRC today has 70% of the world deposits for cobalt that is needed for electric cars and so on. We have huge copper reserves between us or among us. They want that, but they don't want China to access those resources. Our global resources, wherever they may lie, they should be utilized fairly, justly, for the development of all humanity. And China should have access to these resources on terms that benefit all of us. China should not be cut away. So where is China's imperialism? It's their imperialism that we should worry about. And we have got a record and evidence to show. There's nobody who has got any evidence of China's imperialism in Africa. If they have it, let them table it. We see it. It's not there. Sometimes they talk about Chinese private capital misbehaving in Africa. But private capital misbehaves everywhere. Whether it's in China, it's in Europe, it's in America, it's in Africa, private capital misbehaves. And that's why private capital, even in the capitalist countries, they try to regulate it. They are fighting with it all the time. There are sanctions all the time. There are penalties all the time. Chinese capital misbehaves. Private capital misbehaves in China, misbehaves in Zambia, misbehaves in Africa, misbehaves in Europe. All what we need is to deal with that misbehavior and manage it, because there's some good that comes out of private capital as well. But that good has to be balanced with the side effects, the negative impacts. Do they expect China to go and control the behavior of its private capital in Zambia, in Africa? If it's corrupt, who is it corrupting? If an African president involves himself in corrupt activities with a Chinese private company, do they expect the Chinese government to go and start prosecuting, arresting that president, African president? It is our duty as Africans to deal with our own corruption the same way China is dealing with its own corruption. The same way the Europeans, the Americans themselves are dealing with the corruption of their private sector. So where is the imperialism of China? China itself also, they must admit that China was also humiliated like Africa. China was colonized in so many ways. Yes, it suffered from feudal humiliation, but also it suffered from semi-colonial humiliation. The Japanese were there, the British were there, the French were there in China as imperial powers. China was humiliated, Africa was humiliated. Even Chinese labor was taken, exploited all over the world, taken to the Americas as well. The same way Africans were shipped to the Americas. We have a long history with China. We have a present with China. And we have a future with China. They have tried to sway the African masses to hate China, but it's failing. It's failing. Because they can see for themselves. If you see a big hospital in Africa today, who has built it? The Chinese. If you see a big soccer stadium, who has built it? It's the Chinese. If you see a rail line, who has built it? The Chinese. If you see a good road, a good bridge, who has built it? It's the Chinese. We have very little to see today that is coming from the West. China is cooperating with us in a manner that they were not cooperating with us. Are there problems in China? Yes, there are problems. China is building its society in a world dominated by capitalism today and is facing those challenges. And the challenges will be many, but we have to understand the problems or the difficulties, the challenges of our friends from the actions of our enemies. Those who colonized us, those who humiliated us. China has been our friend. China will be is our friend today. China will always be our friend in the future. And the policies of the Chinese government are very clear. They are very clear. They are not hidden. Mutual respect, respect for the sovereignty of other countries, respect for the territorial integrity of other countries, non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. China has never sponsored a coup in any African country. Can the Western countries say the same? Comrade Opoku was talking about Nkrumah. Who overthrew Nkrumah? It was the British and the Americans. Who killed the Patrice Lumumba? It was the Belgians and the Americans. Who killed Gaddafi? We know them. Who killed Nasser? We know them. Who killed Amilcar Cabral? The same people. Show us an African leader that has been killed by the Chinese. Zero, nothing. Who is our enemy? Who is our friend? Who is the imperial power over us? Is it China? The answer is a categorical no. Anybody who feels otherwise, let them provide the evidence of Chinese imperialism. They are demonizing China, they are slandering China every day. It is our collective duty to defend China from slander, to defend our friends from being defamed, from being maligned, because they are our friends. If your friend is attacked, you have a duty to defend your friend. The friendship of Africa and China will last for a very long time. It was not built out of expedience. It was built out of principle, mainly from the Chinese side. China has given more to Africa. It is our duty also now to give what we have to China. And what we have is the ability to defend our friend when they are under attack, to defend our friends when they are being humiliated, when they are being maligned. A defense of China today is a defense of human dignity. It's a defense of all the poor countries of this world. Because to China, we look for inspiration. To China, we look for assistance to develop ourselves without being humiliated, without being colonized. Is every dealing with China smooth? No. There's no human relationship that is smooth, not even our personal relationships. We will manage our differences if they arise with China. Through dialogue, through negotiations. There's no African country that has gone to war with China. We have gone to war with them. China has never bombed a Zambian village, an African village. They bombed our villages. They killed our people. They killed our leaders. Even from the pre-colonial struggles, they were killing our leaders. China has no blood on its hands. The opposite is actually true. China has lost lives in Africa, trying to save the economic and the liberation interests of Africa.
It's difficult to add to that, but the point is that we know what imperialism is. It's not for them to try and bandy words around, okay? There's a long history of imperialism in Africa, and it was not through the Chinese. We're talking about 600 years within which our people have been subjected to slavery, the slave trade, and transportation to America. That's an experience that China shared. We're talking about a period that followed the slave trade of colonialism, in which they sat around a table in Berlin and divided our continent like real estate. We live in countries where there are borders that are drawn through people's houses because they didn't have the diligence to do a survey and avoid that. The people literally have your bedroom in Ghana, your bathroom in Togo. because of the casual way in which French and British forces divided our country. That was not China. The countries that exist in Africa today, the borders that exist, were created by Europeans. Before the Berlin Conference, there were no African states. There was a creation of Europe. And those states were created not for our benefit, but to limit the conflict amongst Europeans about who gets to exploit which parts of the continent. That was imperialism. China wasn't there. Okay? The historical records show the Chinese sailors, armadas, had come to the east coast of Africa centuries ago, discovered, had been curious, but had sailed back and left the people to develop on their own. The processes that we call imperialism, slavery, colonialism, and the new colonial arrangements we have today, in which we have what we call flag and national anthem independence, but the real levers that control our economy are not ours. That's neocolonialism. Okay?
And they have no right to choose friends for us.
Well, but that's the point.
They have no right to choose friends for us. We have the right to choose our own friends. They became associated with us not through voluntary association. They imposed themselves on us. They gave us countries we didn't have. We had one country, one continent. They divided our continent into countries, which, as Comrade Opoku is saying, were theirs. They were not our countries, they were their countries. But with humility, we have accepted them. Okay, let them be our countries. But still more, they are not satisfied with our humility, with our acceptance of them. We don't hate them, but we can live together in a new time, in a new way, in a new world, with dignity, with respect for each other, with cooperation and solidarity. The problem they have is because they have never had relations with other countries based on solidarity. They have always had imperial relationships. They cannot believe that human beings can associate with each other based on solidarity. They cannot believe we can have a relationship with the Chinese that is based on solidarity, on human unity, on common struggles, unified struggles. They think every relationship with a person who is well off than us as Africans is always dominating us. They think we can never have a relationship of equality with anybody else. And also there's a racist attitude in this. Do they think we Africans are fools? Who everybody should dominate the way they dominated us for over 500, 600 years? The Chinese should only come to dominate us? They don't see their domination of us as domination, as something wrong. But they see our association with the Chinese as domination, imperial domination. Let them remove this racist attitude, this racist arrogance, and start to see us as human beings, deserving their respect, deserving their compassion. We have dignity, we have human dignity that deserves respect.
And that reminds me of the interview that the leader of Barbados did with the BBC reporter, because the reporter was so kind of arrogant when she asked the question, because basically she was implying that Barbados are being manipulated, being used as puppet by China through these investments. And the leader of Barbados just said, well, if this is the way you see, that's basically how you see us, because you see us as puppets. So you thought everybody else are using us as puppets. So it's the same, right?
That's correct. They don't have any other frame of reference for a relationship with Africa. It must be master-servant. It is imperialist in its nature. Therefore, what they see happening is China supplanting their imperialism, their empire. They cannot, as Fred said, they cannot conceive of an equal relationship. That's not imperialism. Imperialism doesn't occur just because the two parties have different economic strengths. Imperialism is a relationship of exploitation. And to have imperialism, China would have to be a country in which your big private capital dominates the states. And the state essentially works as a PR firm and as an enforcer for private capital in China. And that is manifestly not the situation. The Chinese state represents the people and asserts the authority of the people over all sectors of the economy, including private capital. China has a lot going for it. But the state is the state. And capital is a subordinate entity within the Chinese community. And in your relationships with Africa, those relationships, the Chinese state is not an imperialist power. And there's a long history, as Fred said, of collaboration. He talked about the situation in Southeastern Africa and the railway. That's not a small example, because we're talking about the period in which China was not the wealthy country that it is today. And there were sacrifices. It meant extreme sacrifice for the Chinese people to help another people develop what was really crucial infrastructure. And it's not an isolated case. If you come to West Africa, I was just rereading this morning the first visit of your Prime Minister Zhou Enlai to Sub-Saharan Africa. It was a visit to President Nkrumah. I reread the transcripts today. It's a discussion, some of the same themes that we have today, about the efforts of the US to drive a wedge between mainland and Taiwan, and to try and create two Chinas to weaken the revolution here. And there was a strategic discussion about how the liberation of African states, and therefore the increase of third world presence in the United Nations, was a strategic tool to deal with the Taiwan problem, ensure that the united China, or in the situation as it turned out, mainland China, represented China in the United States. China was trying to reclaim its position in the UN. And that was tied to the liberation struggle within Africa. China's support was a support to the entire Africa within a clear, mutually agreed strategic framework. Early as 55, China stood up for Africa. China stood up for Egypt in the context of the Suez crisis, when European powers sought to control the canal, which is on Egyptian soil. President Nasser nationalized it.
Young people needed to understand this history in China. Young people needed to understand this history in Africa. Because all over the world, the big changes that take place, the revolutionary changes that take place because of the involvement of young people. Young people are the most moved, quickly moved by injustice, quickly moved by exploitation, quickly moved by oppression. They react very quickly. And if you are not revolutionary as a young person, it's highly unlikely that you'll be a revolutionary in your old age. So we want young people in China, we want young people in Africa to understand where we are coming from, to analyze things for themselves, to see things for themselves, to hear things for themselves, and come to their own conclusions. Because today, lies are being told about China. China is being slandered every day. There is calumny. But how else can they continue to exploit the world if it's not by lies? If it's not by calumny? If it's not by propaganda? They have never hesitated to use lies, to use slander against their opponents, especially over the last couple of years against China. That's the way they operate. Lies is part of their way of operating, way of interacting with the world. But for us who stand on the other side, lies have never been our method. Calumny has never been our methods. Falsehoods have never been our methods. The truth moves slowly. Lies move very fast. But unfortunately for lies, they've got short legs. They don't go very far. Truth goes very far. Their lies against China, their propaganda against China is starting to become known. More and more young people in China, in Africa, are starting to understand what the world they live in is. What the lies they are being told, they are starting to see them as lies. And that gives us a lot of confidence. We revolutionaries on the African continent, for the few days I've been here interacting with young people, I'm confident the Chinese revolution is unstoppable, totally unstoppable. A new wave of progressive young people following the footsteps of Chairman Mao, understanding the theories of Deng, and understanding and following very closely the thought of President Xi, will make this Chinese revolution invisible. Those who think this revolution will disappear, they are cheating themselves. This is unstoppable.
For young people everywhere, in Africa, in China, the shared history is often forgotten. Africa started to become independent and the kind of support that China had. But people also need to remember that at some point in history, in the 19th century, we were both colonized. But large parts of China were subject to European rule. It was carved up pretty much the way Africa was carved up. You had the French here, you had the British elsewhere, and so on. And I think what China refers to as a century of humiliation, it was in many respects similar to the way Africa was treated. Many, many respects, except we, of course, had the Berlin Conference, which carved us up, into 55 different countries.
That humiliation
China had the
unites
correct
us.
solution. Yeah.
That history of humiliation, of being colonized or semi-colonized, unites us.
Yeah.
The countries you see in Africa, the 53 or 54 countries you see in Africa, were not there before 1885. Before 1885, it was just one continent with rivers and valleys. We had no countries. They went to Berlin, the major European nations of that time, including the USA, which had just become independent in 1776, was there in Berlin, including representatives of the Tsar in Russia. No representatives from Africa. They went to Berlin and shared Africa among themselves, like a piece of cake, just cutting. So the countries you see today were not created by us Africans. They were created by the Europeans, not for us, but for themselves.
To manage their conflict. To
Yes,
prevent
and they
a
wanted
war.
to continue holding on to these territories for themselves, not for us. They did not create them to give them to us, to manage, to enjoy, to live in. No. They carved them for themselves to continue exploitation of minerals and indeed even of human beings. They traded us like commodities across the Atlantic Ocean. We were bought and sold and resold and resold. We were not only participants on the capitalist market, we were also commodities on it. That history cannot be forgotten.
And that's also a history China shares.
That history of humiliation, we share it with China. And that's why the Chinese people understand the pain of humiliation. They know what we went through because they went through it. China today is a great country with a great economy, with a great people. But they don't want to accept that China has made progress. They don't want to accept the achievements of the Chinese people. They still want to play them down. They never want to acknowledge that. We, the friends of China, are seeing that progress. And to us, China offers us an alternative way to develop ourselves. We will never get anywhere following the path paved by our colonizers. Only a liberated path that China has pursued can get us out of the poverty that we are in. We have more to learn from China. We have more to cooperate with China. We have more to do with China. China is a source of inspiration for us. And because it's a source of inspiration for us, we have to defend China. We have to defend the achievements of China because these are our achievements. What China has gained over the last 40 years, a good part of it is starting to get to Africa. As I said, China is helping us build our infrastructure. We have many young people coming to Chinese university to be educated. We need to understand how China has gotten, especially over the last 40 years. We need to understand how China has moved from 1949 to today. We have to understand what type of leadership is needed or was needed, and how that leadership was constructed. We need to understand how the Chinese people were mobilized to achieve what they have achieved. This inspiration to us is of great importance. Some people say cooperating with China is having China interfere in our internal affairs. Yes, we know China has a policy of non-interference in the affairs of other countries. But non-interference in the affairs of other countries does not exclude solidarity, does not exclude taking a position. It does not mean doing nothing. And what is international solidarity in the first place? International solidarity is a realization that fighting the same war, albeit on different fronts, for the betterment of humanity. We are in the same vessel, headed in the same direction. If this vessel hits an iceberg, all of us perish. The injustice done to one nation, to one people, should be felt by others, deserves indignation from others. China has been built on those lines of international solidarity, of caring for other human beings, of sharing, and of ensuring a peaceful world. That's what builds peace.
China has built itself up without invading anybody, without enslaving anybody, without colonizing anybody, as you said. And really, if Africa is looking at its options today, there's nobody to enslave. Who are you going to enslave in today's world? Who is Africa going to colonize in order to extract their resources and use to build up in the way that Europe was built on the basis of African blood and sweat? It's not an option. Realistically speaking, in today's world, the only way forward is through a reorganization of society. China has demonstrated that that's possible. The Soviet Union demonstrated it, but ran into internal problems and collapsed. China has taken that much, much further and has demonstrated that it is possible to develop a country, to develop sovereignty, to develop dignity and security without militarization, without having to impose your will forcibly on other people and suppress other people. That has to be the vision of the future. In the nuclear world, there's no other way to grow. If social development is based on military conflict, then we're all dead within a few decades at worst. That can't be the future. So the powers who are busy building military bases trying to enforce their access to other people's resources, other people's land, they're lost. They're taking us all into a tailspin to death and destruction. There is no future for even their own children on the path that they're leading. It's such a glaring thing.
Genuine goodness is always threatening to those on the other side of the moral spectrum. The goodness, the genuineness, the solidarity, the selflessness of China cannot be understood by those on the other side of the moral spectrum. They can't understand it. Mm-hmm. They cannot understand that we can have a relationship with China that is not abusive, that is not exploitative, a relationship in which we are not humiliated, but we are treated with respect as equals. They can't understand that because throughout the capitalist existence, there has been domination, subjugation, humiliation, exploitation, suppression of others. They can't understand that a country can develop without colonizing another country, without humiliating another people. That's what China has done. Again, genuine goodness is always threatening to those on the other side of the moral spectrum.
They built a world in which, from their own statistics, 8 individual human beings own more wealth than half of the globe. 4 billion people own less wealth than the top 8 individuals. How is that sustainable when you have these crushing extremes of poverty and deprivation? How is that democratic? How can you build a democratic world?
They have created a world that today even they themselves are scared of.
We have all the elements of democratic practice. We have in the 90s we have end of military rule, and then we have multi-party democracy. There is regular elections. There is parliament. There is the presidency. There is the judiciary, rule of law. But I tell you, 30 years since that, we have more people are hungry, more people poverty. You have violent criminality. You have extremism, because the institutions of democracy did not evolve from within. They were all superimposed from without. So they did not enjoy the historic development within the people. The sentiment of the, because institutions are supposed to reflect the institution, the concerns of the people. It is supposed to process the concern of the people. It is only institution that processes the concern of the people that can genuinely give vent or give effect to democratic practice and democratic outcomes. In a situation where the institutions of the state, the institutions of the society do not aggregate the common aspiration, the historical experience of the people, there should be divergence. And in the context of divergence, democracy delivers nothing. You have all the trappings of democracy. You have everything, parliament, elected president, but in terms of deliverables, it comes to nothing. And that is the challenge in Africa. That is the more reason why we democratize. The more we democratize, the more social crisis is evident. The more social crisis is imminent. You have more people poor. You have more people out of job. You have, and the young people are responding by choosing extremism. The Boko Haram, education is not wanted, Western education. Well, education is not wanted, not just Western education. So the point of the matter is for us to appreciate how democracy works. Each country will have to engage its own experience. And it is through your experience when you evolve your institution, because institutions are the key mechanism for administering democracy. Without it, democracy is abstract. It does nothing to improve people's livelihood, because if it does not deliver tangibles, if it does not deliver on quality of life of the people, like we have in Africa, we have entered a stage of what we call democratic recession in Africa, where we have all the major framework of a modern Western democracy, but it delivers nothing. In my country, 209 million people. We have a president elected just 2 weeks ago by only 8 million people. People just didn't want to show up because what's the point? Every 4 years, you ask them to queue and thumb the ballot, and some few people sit in parliament. They could have more cars, they could have more houses, they can even have more wives. So what is the point of asking people? So this time around, very few people turned up to vote. We have a president of 2.3 million people elected only by 8 million persons. So in Africa, the challenge now is what people are calling democratic recession. Democracy is receding. Why will it not recede? Because the institutions is not homegrown. The institution does not reflect our sentiment. It does not carry our historic experience. It does not bear any resemblance of our shared and common sentiments. It's completely divorced. And of course, our friends, Americans, the British, they tell us this is excellent for us. So we are kingpin of democracy in the modern world. I've had the privilege of asking Canadian ambassador, can we exchange? You can have ours. You can have ours since it works for you. You can send all Canadians in Nigeria to enjoy our democracy, and then we all can relocate to Canada to enjoy your own democracy. If you think it's so wonderful. The question is, people must evolve the instrument of democracy, and you must appreciate the nature of the state. The nature and character of the state is the main determinant of the state attitude to democratic improvement, democratic practice. Even United States, of course, it is taken for granted that democracy, United States is the beacon of democracy, but people forgot it started with only property males, only heavily propertied males. Then women only have the vote in the 60s. Of course, the blacks never had until very recently. And how did United States become an exemplar of democracy? Because it simply organizes domination across the world. It simply organizes surplus, accumulates surplus on a global scale. With the surplus it accumulates on a global scale, it was able to completely provide some social harmony that ensures a resemblance of democracy, a semblance of quietness. But with countries standing up, like China, the United States began to lose some lucrative outposts of its global accumulation of surplus. Up to today, it is still debated in the United States about who lost to China. It never occurred to them that Chinese simply took back their country. But the fact is, who lost China? Because China was a lucrative outpost in US global accumulation of surplus. And with the loss of China in their own words, the contribution to enhancing the harmony of US democracy got missing. The same thing with other countries. So the point remains that democracy for us in Africa has become a very serious challenge. In as much as it is what we cherish and what we would want, the fact remains that it does not, for now, deliver more result. There is a concern that people should re-examine the experience of others. Like we say in Africa, Chinese experience is not repeatable because it is uniquely Chinese. If you follow the trajectory of the evolution of their institutions and their modern state, but of course it offers a lot of lessons. It offers a lot of lessons because you must secure democracy by improving the material condition of the people. Because following the Cultural Revolution, the question is, what will China do next? Of course, the Chinese said, it is no longer class struggle. It is about the backwardness of the productive forces. We must create the material condition to build socialism. We must create the material condition to build democracy, people's democracy. And it took economic construction, modernization as the key. And 40 years, 50 years down the line, we've seen massive, massive success in that field. So I think China's model of democracy has its appeal, but I believe it is also not simply repeatable by any people. So each people must find the best way, the best mechanism to advance its democratic aspiration, and that can only be done by the people themselves.